gostaria... Não, eu acho que fica aberta a pergunta para o nosso trio aqui. Pois não?
Obrigado. Eu vou fazer em inglês, não é? Porque é para o professor Khalid e o professor Rudolph. Mas eu queria agradecer antes pelo evento. Eu sou o Caio da Connectas, so I'm going to switch to English. Caio Borges from Connectas Human Rights is an NGO based in Brazil. We work with business and human rights, among other issues. Thank you very much for the insightful presentations. My two questions are, the first, as Masueto mentioned, there is an importance in state regulation for CSR. So in this sense, how do you see the importance of recent developments in the field of state-based regulation of corporate social responsibility coming from emerging markets? And I mentioned two concrete examples, which are the investment agreement model that has been recently adopted by Brazil, which brings, for the first time, I think, systematic clauses on corporate social responsibility. So how do you evaluate this kind of initiative? And if it's possible at all to measure the impact that they've had since they're very recent. The second example is the New Development Bank, which is then an initiative of rising powers at a multilateral level. And then the second question is, Professor Fleury mentioned the methodological difficulty and challenge of addressing social issues, and coming from a human rights organization, I totally understand that. And there have been some recent developments like the corporate human rights benchmark. So how do you address this methodology issue of measuring social impact against commitment? So not just the commitment to ISO 26000, but the impact that these companies have on the ground in the perceptions. Thank you.
Antes de passar as respostas, vamos ver se tem outras perguntas. Depois, dado a adiantada hora, se tiver 2, 3 perguntas, depois eu peço para os nossos convidados responderem em geral. Oh, que timidez. Vamos lá, pessoal.
Sou Cíntia, da Arcades. Eu acho que vou fazer em português, que eu me sinto mais à vontade. Falando sobre sustentabilidade, como vocês percebem a cooperação entre os países, a possibilidade de cooperação entre os países? E, falando um pouquinho sobre as ODS, Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, como isso foi pensado, se isso foi abordado no trabalho? E, falando em ODS, quais seriam as similaridades, se vocês poderiam comentar um pouquinho a visão de vocês em relação às ODS para esse trabalho?
Bom, sou Daniele, da Câmara Brasil-Alemanha. My question is about sustainable indicators. Some companies are using high return of investment to see how sustainability gets into their projects. So my question is, what is your perspective? What companies are using to measure sustainability into their activities? Do they use some kind of indicators, or using high is one of these alternatives?
Last one. Sorry, mas é a última.
Oi. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta para o Masueto, que no cenário de desenvolvimento sustentável, né, que a gente está tentando atingir as metas para o desenvolvimento sustentável, como que a lei de preservação da vegetação nativa atuaria buscando as metas do Plano AVEG, né? E dado que a gente vive num país que sofre diversos desmatamentos, né, da vegetação nativa, tanto do Cerrado como a Amazônia, né? E eu queria saber como que a lei estaria relacionada com isso. Obrigado.
Okay, so I'm going to just try and pick up on a couple of questions that I understood. So the question from the colleague there from the NGO asking about Rising Powers and new initiatives on CSR and in particular on investment agreements. So, I mean, for example, one of the most interesting things we came across in the project was the attempt by India to pass a CSR law. So India now has a legal requirement. Indian firms of a certain scale have a legal requirement to invest 2.5% of their net profits into CSR activities. However, the way the Indian government defines that, CSR is seen as anything outside of core business. So compliance issues, how you might manufacture something or whether there are pollutants emerging from what you're engaging with, by the way in which the Indian government has defined CSR is seen as outside of the scope of the CSR law. So essentially the CSR law in India has become a kind of agenda around seeing the corporate as a civic actor, being engaged in civic investment, civic development, so firms involved in philanthropy, if you like, or in terms of developing local education support, health support, and so on and so forth, rather than looking at how firms engage in terms of how we might understand corporate social responsibility. But the Indian law has now had a lot of influence, so that in China now they're debating something similar, and they're trying to think, well, would we follow a similar kind of strategy? So I think there is a big challenge in terms of how CSR gets interpreted and used across these three contexts. And in Brazil, I think because comparatively compared to many of these other countries, these debates are much more mature in Brazil, particularly around the environmental dimension, and particularly because the state has been very actively engaged around these issues. I think it's important to see how that might get shaped. On investment agreements, that's, I think, one potential area where this will become particularly interesting. On the new development bank, the Chinese bank that's coming forward, I don't yet know how they're beginning to incorporate that. I mean, they've talked about environmental impact analysis being incorporated into their lending strategies. But exactly how they might go about it, I think, is a moot point. But it's an important point because they're going to be funding a lot of the monies that's going to go into this sort of OBOR, One Belt, One Road type of massive infrastructure strategies, which have huge environmental consequences. Sustainability indicators. So I think, I mean, maybe Afonso can say a bit more about how we saw the evidence coming out in Brazil, but certainly there is now more of an agenda around reporting. So things like the GRI initiative and so on is being addressed, and firms are trying to find ways to kind of bring that to the fore, and also to look at various different numerics that might help them to illustrate that. So one of the key things that we found where we got more engagement by the heads of sustainability in many of these firms was they were themselves being challenged on terms of how you go about measuring it. So there's a lot of learning going on, trying to understand how are developed country firms of similar scales with also very diverse and complex supply chains, how are they exactly doing it? Because this is something that they want to report on. But there is initiatives to that for, and I think Afonso could say a bit more from the Brazilian cases.
Possibly following on immediately from this note here, we have some evidence from some firms or let me start in the following way. There is probably a risk-based approach to CSR, and I think there is a more strategic approach to CSR, and we have seen that particularly in India, there is almost like a clear cut between the sample of firms that we have here. A risk-based approach meaning you try to comply, so you report appropriately on all the indicators that are given to you from the external auditing organizations, and that would be one approach. But when you look back at the presentation that I tried to convey the point here that some firms are moving above and beyond that. and they are actually also developing their own indicators, which then are linking sustainability to actual performance. So there is this Madura case, were a very successful case because they were, by innovating appropriately, bringing in clean technologies, at the same time bringing down water consumption, energy consumption. And that would be an indicative example of companies which are sort of trying to look at improving their sustainability, but at the same time also their competitive advantage, with a view on being at the forefront of the company's internationally speaking, so on the forefront of producing in a competitive fashion when the resources run out, practically. And coming back to, there was a comment here around the social impact versus sort of stated commitment, right? Reported commitment. Not core of this particular exercise, although we have a colleague in Manchester, Stefan Sagelmeier, who is doing a sub-project on HR, human rights reporting, and in international firms, and he was looking at samples of firms, actually at the reports from Brazilian, from Indian, Chinese, and then also US, Germany and France companies. And that goes slightly a little bit in the direction of your question, I would have imagined. You could argue that this type of reporting, as you would find it in reports, it is an indicator of commitment, a stated commitment, but doesn't necessarily translate immediately into real outputs. But interestingly enough, we could see that in this study, which is not yet published, coming forward, that Brazil is doing relatively well, comparatively speaking. India is doing excellent, of course, with respect to stated commitment, because it is forced to do. In the Brazilian context, I would argue that could probably be explained by this state, or you were calling it social contract argument, and then some other firms in France and so on. We're well above even American firms. So real impact, I wonder how we could include that in a more hard way in outputs. GRI and other reporting initiatives are certainly helping in this direction.
Bom, eu não sei como responder essa pergunta, mas assim, é muito importante essa floresta, a vegetação nativa, enfim, para o desenvolvimento de um país, inclusive para o Brasil. Nesse aspecto, quer dizer, um ponto positivo, novamente, essa interação entre ONGs e entre Ministério Público, que tem sido muito ativo nessa área ambiental. Por exemplo, lá na região amazônica, a gente tem o Amazon, do Beto, e eles são extremamente ativos no combate ao desmatamento e também no combate de qualquer tipo de mudança legal, que eles entendem que isso possa promover mais desmatamento na região. Mas também o Ministério Público, se a gente olha algo como 9 anos atrás, mais ou menos, teve um caso, se não me engano, em 2008, que um relatório do Greenpeace, a partir de uma investigação do Ministério Público, levou a um grande escândalo, que se descobriu que todos os grandes frigoríficos no Brasil e todos os grandes supermercados estavam comprando carne de áreas de desmatamento. Isso levou, enfim, a um grande escândalo, a assinatura de termos de ajustamento de conduta entre frigoríficos, supermercados e Ministério Público, para simplesmente boicotar a compra, enfim, de carnes que não pudesse ser rastreada e que eventualmente pudesse vir de áreas de desmatamento. A moratória da soja é outro grande exemplo. A vegetação nativa é claramente importante para um país, em termos de sustentabilidade. Do ponto de vista de Estado e do ponto de vista de ONG, eu vejo justamente uma das áreas, de muitas áreas, que você precisa ter esse check and balance. Quer dizer, você precisa ter um movimento da sociedade civil muito ativo para tentar evitar qualquer tipo de retrocesso e pressionar a legislação para proteger essas áreas. Mas, do ponto de vista, se a gente olha como é hoje essa legislação no Brasil do que era 15, 20, 30 anos atrás, você vê claramente um grande progresso. É claro que, assim, novamente, o que tem sido fundamental nessa área é tanto uma atuação muito independente do Ministério Público, que foi o que caracterizou bastante o Ministério Público ali nos anos 90 e nos anos 2000, e ONGs muito ativa, inclusive que em qualquer mínimo sinal de retrocesso, de desmatamento, etc., elas são bastante ativas de cobrar por meio da imprensa, etc., medidas, enfim, que combatem esse tipo de desmatamento, etc., e aumentem o monitoramento dessas áreas sob risco. É isso, quer dizer, basicamente isso. De fato, essa não é minha área, eu não entendo muito, né? Mas, claramente, olhando e conversando com os amigos, assim, é muito claro que essa área no Brasil, nos últimos 20 anos, teve um imenso progresso.
Bom, vamos encerrar finalmente.